So we need a list of users here on the users page instead of our dummy users. So we'll actually get rid of the dummy users here. And instead here, I want to send a HTTP request. And I want to send that request whenever this page loads. And that's a difference, of course, to the auth page. There we send the request in a function when we click the button. Now I want to do this when this page loads. Hence, we could, of course, send a fetch request here, right inside of our component function. And as soon as this component renders, we send the request, right? The problem is, we would also always send this request whenever the component re-renders, which it most likely does once we got the response data and we change something on the page. So we would actually create an infinite loop. To work around that, we can use a React hook, the use effect hook here. The use effect hook allows us to run certain code only when certain dependencies change. The code that runs is defined in the function, which is our first argument. The second argument is an array of dependencies, so of data that needs to change for this to rerun. And if this is empty, it means it will never rerun. It will only run once, which is exactly what I want here. So now inside of this only once running useEffect function, we can send our request to http localhost 5000/API/users. And if we check our backend and we check the users routes there, we see it's just /users. Keep in mind, we only reach this file if we're on API/users here. So it's just /users, which triggers this function, which is the function I want to trigger. And in this function, in the getUsers function, in the end, we return a list of users. So I want to send a request there. It should be a GET request. Hence, we don't need to configure this to send a POST request or anything like that. We also don't need to add a content type header because we're not attaching any data. We're not attaching any content to the outgoing request. And we also, therefore, don't need to attach any body. So this request is good like this. Now, it does yield a promise, so we can use then here or async await. Now, here's one important rule. Don't turn this function here into an async function. You could technically do that and it would work, but it's not good code. UseEffect doesn't want a function here which returns a promise. And any async function, so any function where you add async, will automatically and always return a promise. So don't do that. It's not good code. It goes against what UseEffect expects here. So instead, you can create a iffy, so an immediately executing function. I will name it send request here. This is now a function which in the end has this fetch command in it. This now can use async, and it will then execute this function right away here in the end. So this is just a pattern which I would recommend if you want to use async await, because using async here is not recommended and not really wanted. So now we can await our response here. And then, of course, we can get the response data by awaiting response.json. And now we want to use the response data. And that's also a difference to before. In the auth component, I didn't care about the response data in the success case. I just called auth login. Now here I do care about the response data. So we actually still want to manage the loading and the error state here, but I also want to manage my response data. So we can again use state hook here and set up some states in this component. We got the isLoading state, which we set with setIsLoading, which initially is false. We got the error state, and set error, of course, initially undefined. And we got the, let's say, data state, or actually loaded users maybe, since we know that this is what we'll have here, and set loaded users. And this initially is also undefined, let's say. And now here, we got the response data. Once we get that, I want to call set loaded users and set this equal to response data. And now let's have a look at the backend and see what exactly we get back. We get back an object which has a user's key, and that user's key will be an array of users. So in our response, we should have that user's key. So here I want to set my loaded users, which should be an array, equal to response data.users. I also will set is loading to false here because I want to set it to true right before we send the request. Here, set it to true. We also might have an error, so we can use try catch again. Move all of that into try and then catch errors here. And then in here, we can therefore also set is loading to false, but I also want to set my error to error.message. And just as before, we don't get an error by default if we have a 400-ish or 500-ish status code. So I will check if the response is not okay, so if we have such a code, in which case I throw my own error here. Response data.message. And then we'll still make it into this catch block. We could now also move set is loading after try catch so that this only runs no matter if we do have an error or not. Here in the catch block, we then just update the error state. Otherwise, we update set loaded users. Now I will also add a function, error handler, just as before, where I will call set error and reset this. And now we can add the error modal and the loading state, and of course also then make sure we use our loaded users. So let's first of all import some extra component here. Let's import the error modal from the shared folder, and there from components, UI elements, error modal. And let's repeat this for the loading spinner, this other component we have in there. With both imported, let's go down to our JSX code. And here, items which I pass in should be my loaded users now. But besides that, I will use React fragment because I want to have multiple top-level JSX elements here, which only works with React fragment around them. Because, of course, I also want my error modal here. And the error I pass in is the error state we're managing. OnClear points at the error handler. And besides the error modal, I also want to show a loading spinner. So dynamically, I'll check if isLoading is true. And if it is, I will actually add a div here with a class name of center. That's a globally defined CSS rule. And in there, I want to output my loading spinner to have a full screen loading spinner. With all of that, let's see whether that works. If we save that, we get an error here. Cannot read property length of undefined. Now this error makes sense for two reasons. For one, it makes sense because we render a users list all the time. That includes the initial rendering of this component. So before this request was sent and before we got back a response. Loaded users initially is just undefined. And undefined doesn't have a places property, and therefore there is no way for us to render anything. So we should actually only render the users list here if we're not loading and if we got loaded users. Then I want to render this users list so that we don't render this if loaded users is undefined. With that, this looks way better. Now, we still don't output places correctly, and you see I picked a really cool picture here for my avatar. But besides that, you see the number of places is incorrect. There is no number shown at all. The reason for that is that the places we get back now on our loaded users is actually an array of places. In the users list component, we expect places to actually be, well, the number of places itself. So actually, since places now is an array, we just need to change this and set place count equal to user.places.length. And with that, if we saved it, we see 0 places. So now we can click on a user and we're taken to that user's page. But of course, we can't load any places because at the moment we have no places. So we want to make sure that now when we are logged in, we can also create new places. However, before we do that, we might want to reorganize our HTTP request sending code a bit because, as I mentioned before, we have a lot of duplication. Managing all the loading and error state is basically always the same. The same is true for extracting the data and checking the response status. And I don't want to repeat that in every component which needs to send a request. This screams for a custom hook, and hence we will create one, a custom hook that sends requests and manages all the related state.